I think we're ready to start here. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this year's Social Policy Conference. My name is John McGeady. I'm CEO of Social Justice Ireland. Our conference chairperson for the day is Mick Clifford. Mick has been working as a journalist in the national media for 25 years, principally in print. He is currently the special correspondent for the Irish Examiner. In 2016, Mick won the Newspaper Industry's Journalist of the Year award. He also has extensive experience in broadcast media as both a presenter and panelist, and currently presents a weekly podcast. He's the author of 6 books, including the best-selling A Force for Justice, The Maurice McCabe Story. So I think we're ready to begin. So I'll hand over to you, Mick. Thanks very much.
John, thank you very much for that introduction. We're here today, folks, the annual policy conference, and we have some very interesting speakers for you today. Now, unfortunately, one of our advertised speakers, Siobhan O'Neill, and it was totally beyond Siobhan's powers, unfortunately. She's a witness in a court case that had already been moved. The dates were moved again at the last minute, and unfortunately she had to attend there today. But for those of you who are interested in Siobhan's presentation, her paper will be included in our book of conference proceedings, which will follow in due course. That, as I say, is very unforeseen, and we are unable to do anything about that. However, we have a group of very interesting speakers with a very diverse range of presentations. I suppose just to give a little context of where we're coming from today, look, the country's going through several major transitions, each of which includes challenges which are only going to deepen with time. And while much is changing, many of the problems facing society are long-standing. We're all aware of those: inequality, poverty, and underinvestment in our social infrastructure. All of these remain major issues. And although the economy in Ireland has experienced record growth since the pandemic, infrastructure and services in areas such as housing, healthcare, and public transport are far below the levels and standards that would be expected in a normally functioning society. Likewise, developments in areas such as taxation, participation, and sustainability all fall below the minimum standards. I don't think anybody would take issue with that position. Now, Social Justice Ireland has proposed a policy framework for a new social contract, and that identifies 5 key policy outcomes. And those are a vibrant economy, decent services and infrastructure, just taxation, good governance, and, as we mentioned earlier, sustainability. We need investment in infrastructure and services to develop a thriving economy. We need just taxation to fund this. We need good governance to ensure people have a say in shaping the decisions that impact them. We also need to ensure that everything is done in a sustainable environment. Everything that is done is sustainable. That's environmentally, economically, and socially. Each of these 5 key policy outcomes must be achieved if a new social contract is to be realised. And this will require working on each of the 5 areas simultaneously. Focusing, for example, on just economic growth and expecting everything else to follow has not worked, and all the evidence is it will not work. So while Social Justice Ireland has always recognised the need for a vibrant economy, policies to promote economic development must be implemented in tandem with the provision of decent services, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability. Ultimately, only social justice and the well-being of everybody in the country, whether born here or newly arrived, will ensure a stable, healthy, and open society. Achieving these 5 goals requires that we recognise that it is time for a new approach if we are to manage these transitions and deliver real and meaningful change. Now, our expert speakers today will present their ideas and set out how we can achieve these goals. First up, we have Kieran Nugent. Kieran's an economist with the Nevin Economic Research Institute and is based in the Dublin office. He's currently pursuing a doctorate with the Department of Sociology in Maynooth, with assistance from the Irish Research Council through the employment-based programme. He lectures part-time in Maynooth in political economy and the welfare state, and he sits on the Living Wage Technical Group. He also sits on the board of directors of GEMS Northern Ireland. His research interests include returns to education, overqualification, social mobility, income distribution, precarious work, the cost of living, and intergenerational inequality. The title of Kieran's paper for today is Labour Market Outcomes of Third Level Graduates in High Income EU Members. Is Fathers' Education Important? And what we know about labour market outcomes and the living standards of workers in 2024. So over to you, Kieran. Kieran, excuse me, Kieran, you're mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Now, as soon as I put up those slides, everybody disappears. So if the share screen then, is it? You can't see. Where's my share? Okay. Can you see that now? Let's see here now. Okay.
Yeah, see that now. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
So
great, Kieran, thanks.
Thanks a million, Mick. So yeah, the second part of that very long title is just some thoughts for this presentation. The title of the report I'm presenting today is Labour Market Outcomes of Third Level Graduates in High Income EU Members, and whether or not fathers' education is important. I use fathers' education here as a proxy for social origin. So this report is part of my PhD with Maynooth. Sean here is on the supervisor team in Maynooth, and I'm doing it through the IRC and my institute, the Nevin Economic Research Institute. So it's a report as part of a series of reports which are underpinning the research, and it's bringing together bigger themes of social mobility and in particular third level education as an engine for social mobility, and looks at trends over a period of about 15 years using the Survey on Income and Living Conditions, which had three special modules in 2005, 2011 and 2019, which provides details on the backgrounds of individuals, where you can kind of analyze then what the education levels are, how your background affects that in an Irish context, and then as well I've looked at the labour market outcomes of third level graduates by their social origins. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly recap there's three reports that preceded that. So basically what those reports show from this data is that, you know, we know the story of Ireland's third level education, generational change. Basically in the space of a generation, we've gone from one of the lowest shares of the adult population with third level attainment to now the highest. It depends on how you measure what age group, but recently I was looking at the 25 to 34-year-old group, and over 60% of those have attained some kind of third level education in Ireland. It's the highest in Europe. And what the SILC data shows is when you look at the breakdown by broad education, I'm just gonna for people to get their heads around what we're looking at here. This is called the International Standard Classification of Education, and it's broadly split up into kind of 8 small groups, but in the analysis and in a lot of the data you get online, the publicly available data, there's kind of 3 broad groups. So this is the group we're looking at here, okay, which, you know, is a growing growing number. This group here is constantly shrinking as well, and is coming down to, I think it's less than 10% for some of the for younger generations. I'm just going to flick back there again just for a second. So what that what the analysis shows in the previous report is, as we've expanded third level education, now adults whose father, I'm just going to say, you know, I don't like language like low levels of education. It's just in this analysis, low levels of formal education. So if your father had was in this lowest bracket in Ireland, and you're Irish, you're more likely now to have a third level education than 12 other countries, high income countries that I look at in the analysis. So that's been the outcome, and we can kind of put that in terms of, you know, equality of opportunity has, you know, there's a very positive story there on access and on attainment in terms of broad access. Also, there's what that showed was in every country there's still gaps between. You're more likely to have a third level education if your father had a third level education. That's true in every one of the countries. And by the two, there's a gradient then with if your father was in the middle bracket, and then if your father was in the lowest bracket, that you're less likely to have a third level education. So that came across very strongly in all the data. As in every year as well, in all the 3 years. So like 39 examples, 39 time and places we looked at. I'm just showing that just to show you how important third level education is today in the Irish economy, and just show you the gaps there between. This is the younger under 40s group, but there's still large gaps. You're still much more likely to be employed in the first place with a third level education. The middle income bracket usually involves kind of, you know, post PLCs and apprentices and the Leaving Cert, etc. And these days as well, if you're in the lowest bracket of education, you can see there it like compared to even the Celtic Tiger, it's still way down. Now it's a smaller group of the population, but only 1 in 4 in 2003, less than 1 in 4 in 2003 were in any kind of employment. Okay. And I want to show you as well, these are just the drivers in terms of the big conversation. And what informs my conversation obviously is, are too many people going to third level education? And what's the, you know, on the supply side, and then what's on the demand side for third level graduates? Are there labor market outcomes? Are they getting decent work? I'm not exactly speaking about decent work in this presentation, but about what we're calling high-end employment, and I'll come back to what that means in a minute. But this just to show you the difference, and this is a Eurostat comparison of deprivation. So of people who answer on a survey that they can't afford the basics. You know, it's almost non-existent for people, even in the 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, this doesn't count the ones that are still living at home, but I'll come back to that as well. But the ones that live independently, it's still almost non-existent that there's deprivation there for third level graduates in Ireland. Okay, 1.1%. And then when when you just go down, I didn't even add the lowest bracket of formal education, which obviously the deprivation rates are higher, but because there's so few of them. But if you're in the middle bracket, and you're female, right? And this, you know, there's more women in every country with third level education now as well. It's over 1 in 4 are in material deprivation if you haven't gone and taken the step to third level attainment. Okay, in 2023, it's a pretty big number, and that's actually you know, deprivation is measured differently in Europe as it is in Ireland. The Irish figure is going to be higher than that. The Eurostat figure for the national rate of deprivation is lower. It's just that they ask different questions, and they measure differently out of the items. They ask different, they ask you if you can afford the basket of goods they ask about is just slightly different, so you get slightly different answers. So that's the story there. Anyway, that's where we are now. 44% of the adult population in that's in 2019. My analysis goes to 2019. That's without a doubt higher now as people retire and new adults come in at 18 to 20. They're way more likely to have a third level education. The older ones are. So just compositionally, that's every year is getting higher. I mentioned this 60% earlier on for the 25 to that's 25 to 29 years. So it's really high and about 50% higher than the EU average. And that's just to show you that it's women are more likely on every one of my sample countries to have a third level education. And this has gone from one of the, not the bottom, but one of the bottom ones in the 90s, and just, had a big shoot up there over the last 25 years or so, 30 years. Now, I don't want to go bamboozle anybody with any, too many graphs, too many pictures, but that's what I discussed there. Every country has this gradient here. 66% of Austrians whose father had a third level education have a third level education. Okay, but that only applies to 35.9% of those whose father had a middle level, was in the middle bracket of formal education. So it's the same in every country and every year. That's 2005, 2011, 2019. And in most countries, that gap has been closing. And I just want to concentrate on Ireland, which we're talking about today, obviously. And we see there as well that the actual intergenerational transmission of third level education is the strongest in Ireland out of any of these countries. And there's no country in any of the 3 years that is higher than any of these three numbers, even back as far as 2005. So in 2005, 82% of those whose father had a third level education got a third level education. It's grown slightly since then, but what we've seen with the expansion of third level education, which is this first bar here, which is now up to 60%. We've seen what's happened there is those with fathers in the lowest bracket of formal education have increased their third level attainment. So they're almost half, even coming from, it's a broad proxy for working class backgrounds, whatever that means. But in this case, for obviously measured by education, but it's almost half, which is by far the biggest. A lot of them, we're looking at Portugal here, it's only 21%, Italy 12.3%, Germany 20%. So it really is in that broader context of equality of opportunity. It's a good story in the Irish context, and we know that we've heard about that. But my interest in my research is whether and how that translates into the labor market. Okay, and on the demand side, and just I mentioned the importance of third level education earlier on there, but this is for every country as well, but particularly in Ireland, that the share of occupation, the share of employment that's in these high-end occupations has been growing and growing and growing, and it's about 45.3% of 2019. It's going to be higher than that in 2023. So what I want to look at is what's broadly called overqualification in the labor market. So Eurostat have started publishing some of this data as in their stat bank and in their kind of what's publicly available in the tables at the high end. And what it shows is that Ireland has is one of the countries in the EU with the highest level, and certainly in a high income context, one of the highest levels of overqualification. And what does that mean? Overqualified graduates, and it's about 30%. So about 3 in 10 Irish graduates, and still about the same. The data I have here now is for 2019, but I looked at it recently. It's come down a little bit, but not much. But it's about 3 in 10 third level graduates working in Ireland are working in jobs that do not require third level education. Okay. And I'm not going to go into how it's measured, just to say that it's an objective measure and there's other ways to measure it. And there's plenty of debate in the literature about which one's better, which one of the 3 or 4 are better. I've taken this objective one, which is easy. It's one of the easier ones to implement and to look at, and this is the one that they're also publishing on the Eurostat website. So we're looking at this schema, the International Standard Classification of Occupations, is designed, and the categories are chosen based on the entry requirements in formal education, the level, right? So, and these are decided who's in what group by, wonks in the ILO that decide and that look into this. So we're what we're going to call quote unquote high-end professions are these top 3: managers, professionals, technicians, and associate professionals. And they're, what I'm loosely calling, we're looking. These are the jobs that I'm assuming you want if you have a third level education. They're associated with, social mobility, with high status, and with higher wages. Okay, and what this overqualification measure looks at is the people who have this level of education but happen to be working outside of these top 3 in occupations that have lower social status and lower associated wages. Okay, and what I'll tell you just straight quick off the bat is that about 80% of them are in these first 2 categories. Okay, doesn't apply as much to skilled ag and to craft and related trades and plant and machine operators, probably because a lot of them are associated with kind of vocational tracks in training anyway. So it felt like it made sense to me. So about 80% of all overqualified workers are in these 2 brackets. Okay, and just to give you an idea of high-end occupations, we got legislators, executive officers. In the professionals, which is the biggest of the 9 categories, you got teachers, nurses, doctors, civil engineers, and all sorts. And then the third one is the associate professionals and technicians group, usually related to lower levels of third level education. Unfortunately, the analysis can't decipher between the different levels. It's just five and up, just because that's the available data, unfortunately. But these are generally associated with, might not be a master's, might be more of a higher diploma or a higher certificate, or a degree, but slightly low. The average number of years or the average type of qualification is going to be lower than in the professional group. Okay. Now these are it's a blunt instrument for looking at overqualification, but I do think it's reasonable to say, and this is just a couple of screen grabs here for the other types of workers we're talking about, but I think it's reasonable to say that an office clerk or a bank teller or a cook or a barman or workers in the service industry do not require third level education. I've worked in some of these jobs myself, and I think that's, even though it's a blunt instrument and there are, it'll throw up different estimates depending on the measure. I still think that this is a minimum measure of how prevalent overqualification is among graduates. So I'll just fly through those anyway. I think it's the same, but again, as I said, these workers don't really turn up in the overqualification group, at least not in Ireland. Excuse me. So what I wanted to look at was the labour market outcomes of third level graduates. This was another report I did, and just to say, and I'm skipping by this as well, and sorry to bamboozle you with this massive table. I have to cut down on my country sample for the actual end product, but I just want to bring your attention to Ireland and Spain, who have similarly relatively bad outcomes in terms of the share of workers that are actually in high-end employment. We call them matched the high-end employment. Okay, so we see here, and I just picked out a couple of other examples to highlight in green there. We see Sweden is doing, far better. We're no surprise there. Portugal's also doing far better, but for different reasons. I think I mentioned that they've much lower shares, even in 2024, of third level attainment, and they've picked a different approach than many of the other countries. Italy is similar to Portugal. So the Finns, the Danes, no surprise there, as comes up a lot. The Scandinavians are outperforming a lot of the other countries. So it's Ireland and Spain, and sometimes Ireland does even worse than Spain, depending how you're measuring it. 54% of all graduates 25 to 59 in Ireland in 2019 were in one of these high-end jobs, and this was much lower than it was even 15 years previous. And so, what are the policy implications there when we're looking at if we're talking about skills needs in other sectors, such as construction or wherever else, are there policy implications there? So again, similar to what I said about the trend with the third level education attainment by background, then we're going to just take this whole group of third level graduates, and we're going to see by their background how they're doing in the labour market. And there's a similar gradient. Again, I don't want to bamboozle you with all these boring charts that I'm the only one who can read off the bat. But like we've got this strong class trend here, again, in every country. Again, some partial exceptions in the Scandinavian countries. What does that say? It says of all the third level graduates, right, if your father had third level education, then 70% of you in Austria have gained high-end employment, whereas it's just over half of the graduates who are coming from a working class, quote unquote, background, where your father is the lowest bracket of formal education. So that was a good, you have confidence again when they're the numbers coming out from the analysis. So good, strong, I wanted you to just look at those arrows there to see the direction. And we're going to go, obviously, focus on Ireland. And again, so that's the kind of story of the three reports, okay? Ireland has done very well on equalising access to third level education, done relatively, the best in class of all of these in the last 15 years. But at the same time, they're worst in class or second worst in class when it comes to the labour market outcomes of these graduates, specifically those who are from, in the brackets where their fathers have lower formal levels of education. So we see here that earlier. So I showed you this here earlier on. So it's 54% of all graduates have high-end employment. But when you come down here and look, there's a gradient then to the background. Okay, so 60, but they're still not doing great. Even in 2005, the share of those from I hate using the term high social origins, but that's comes in the
Sorry, Kieran, I think your split screen has gone there. You're referencing
this here. What are you saying there? Sorry.
Sorry, we have you. Sorry, I thought you were referencing a chart there. We have you on screen rather than the.
You don't have this chart with the two tables on it, no?
Not
With
at
the
the
two
moment. We
charts.
had up until now. But
Okay, I
it'll be
don't know
nice.
what's happened there. I don't know what I clicked on. What about now?
No,
No, okay. Let's see here. Oh, I don't know how what's going on there.
you're flying up until that point.
Okay, right. I'm just gonna stop sharing and share again. Okay, 1 second. Okay, and then how about now?
No.
No. Okay, stop sharing. Sorry about that now. We back?
Yeah, there you are. Perfect.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay. So this is the main chart again. Thanks, Mick, because it's the most important chart of the presentation. So what we're seeing there is almost a 20-point difference, and it's less than half of those graduates I said that have gotten that opportunity to attain their third level education, but then once they're in the labor market, less than half of them have actually, according to this Silk data in 2019, less than half of this group have actually managed to get one of these high-end occupations in the managers, professionals, and associate professionals and technicians. And it's only about 2/3 of those from the higher social origins, quote unquote. Okay, and in the middle bracket then again is in between those. So a big gap, and that's one of the biggest gaps, if not the biggest gap of all the countries we looked at. UK, unfortunately, we don't have 2019 because they left, but they have a smaller gradient there. Spain has a bit, again, I mentioned Spain as not a great performer. Spain has a big gradient there, big differences between those of different backgrounds. Sweden, as you'd expect, and I said some of them are partial. There's partial exceptions to the gradient. You see that in 2019 with Sweden, that the high, the middle, those from middle skill backgrounds, from where their fathers had middle level of formal education, it's about the same in terms of the outcomes of graduates, so that's the wide story there. And I'll let you think about what the policy implications are. This isn't in the paper, but I just did the analysis on, because it was there, by background rather than the father's education, but whether or not the father was themselves in a high-end occupation. And there's a strong, this time it's a boy, it's just two categories, but it's a strong relationship there as well. Okay, so much bigger. So if your father was a manager professional or associate professional, then that's transferring down intergenerationally more then obviously if your father was in one of the occupations that require lower levels of formal education. Okay, so that's the crux of it. I just want to quickly just go over a couple of things about 2024 that aren't related to that paper in particular, but loosely related, and just about living standards at the moment and wages. Again, bamboozling you would be a massive chart there, but just this is the latest data on wages, and we've been hearing a lot about strong wage growth, but I just want to show you that in real terms and over a year and over 5 years, that this, there's a distribution there, and lots of sectors are not doing well over 5 years. Some of them are down over 5 years either. What's driving that average wage has been high-end employment, particularly in IT, and we know, I'm sure we've all heard of that, and there's been good employment growth there, but it's at over 5 years, it's way ahead of everybody else, and they're some of the best paid jobs in Ireland, and it's wages at the top end that have been driving that average rate, which has implications then for conversations around inflation. We're worried about wage driven inflation. The fact of the matter is we've had the highest nominal wage growth in the last year, average again, at the same time as the inflation rate has come down to a lower point than it has been in years either. So I just want to point out this: we've a lag of a year in terms of wage data the distribution, but I just want to put your attention to, and again, I hope you know, I'll just explain what these are percentiles. So this is the distribution. So the P99 is basically the wages of the person who earns more than 99% of Irish workers and less than 1%. And at that point in the distribution, over the last number of years, the wage growth has been much higher at the top and has been, you know, almost non-existent in the middle and the bottom for over the last 5 years. So it's just something to keep in mind. And I also want to just talk about the you know, what's happened there, what's driven an increase in deprivation, because deprivation has gone up in the last 2 years, according to the latest data. That's been driven by, actually been driven by workers and by those in employment, whose wages have not kept up with inflation. And, you know, I'm looking at some indicators there for that usually apply more to young people. So I just want to talk about, just quickly show you this. The rate of growth over the last 20 years for those of working age has been about half of that for those over 65. So we've seen that reflected in the deprivation data. So what does this say about the most highly educated generation in, you know, one of the most highly educated generations in the history of civilization? So we're how's that translating to labor market outcomes and living standards and the general kind of life steps, you know, home ownership, marriage, all these kind of things are all being affected by the other side of the equation. So the employment situation has obviously been good in the last 2 or 3 years. Obviously record growth and all that kind of thing, but there's something there. There's some issue there with real wages in terms of the basics, and we can see there massive decreases in home ownership for younger people, younger workers, and you know, the massive increase where if they're not buying houses, where are they? Well, a lot of them are still living at home, and it's increased more. That share is up to 40% of 25 to 34-year-olds. Remember, as I said, the most educated group in Europe, and 40% of them are living at home. There's implications there, obviously, for family formation, for all sorts of things. And remember that they're not students. Only 5% of that group are students. 70% of them are working full time. So it's, you know, we're talking about real wages. It's obviously nominal wages are high relatively in Ireland, but what's on the cost of living side, and obviously housing is the big issue. And we see you know, you're 4 times more likely to not be able to afford the basics if you're a renter than if you're owner occupied. You know, this again, I just want to look at a few indicators that don't get much attention. So just to say that young couples with children are, in an Irish context, struggling with financial insecurity at rates at the top of the list, first and second in all these 3 categories here, types of households. So obviously, you know, we've all the supply side, it looks like, taken care of. It's on the demand side, on the cost of living side, and on the outcome side, where there continue to be problems in 2023, 24, despite all these, you know, the story there. So that's me. Thanks a minute.
Kieran, thank you very much for that. And before I say anything further, I must apologise that that instance where I said you'd lost a split screen, it was me who pressed a wrong button and the gremlins were there. And I think few of our people have notified us that that was the case. So apologies for that. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation, and it's really shows you that how it requires getting down into the granular detail of that kind of research to show us exactly what's happening in that whole area of education and improving from generation and what have you. And we already have a few questions in on that, which we're going to address in our Q&A. And just once again, folks, just to remind you, you'll see that we're all used to it at this stage, the Q&A function there. Please keep your questions coming in, and we will definitely try to get as many of them as possible. Now, our next speaker is Sean O'Rian. Sean is a professor of sociology at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. His research interests are in the sociology of work and employment, comparative political economy, inequality and social change, and the global information economy. Sean is the author of a number of works, including The Politics of High-Tech Growth, Development Network States in the Global Economy, and The Rise and Fall of Ireland's Celtic Tiger, Liberalism, Boom and Bust. He is a member also of the National Economic and Social Council. He was a member from 2011 to 2017. The title of Sean's presentation is From Fragmentation to a Common Purpose, the Role of Public Services.
Right. Thanks a lot, Mick. I'm just going to try and share this now, hopefully. I think you can see that okay, can you?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, and Kieran, I have a few questions for Kieran. Some will be for our next meeting out here in Maynooth, and some will be for today, but very interesting presentation. So my talk this morning is really about public services and public services in Ireland. I suppose it mixes together some bits of overview data and give a sense of the landscape of public services in Ireland. And then really to try and think through two other things then. Really, one is more how public services, how should we think about public services? And I think the Social Justice Ireland policy framework and the whole piece around the nature of public services and so on is really welcome in terms of the broad way that it kind of conceptualizes public services. Not simply, well, we'll go on to what that, what that would involve, but public services are central to all kinds of dimensions of our lives, not simply to what we might think of as like social welfare or redistribution even. And then I just want to say a little bit at the end about how public services can play a key role in kind of stabilizing and renewing a social contract, that there is kind of a central part to that kind of social solidarity and practical everyday maintaining of social solidarity in the society. That is that's really critical, and we see the implications of what happens when it starts to erode. Okay, so so basically 3 parts: quick overview of Irish public services, some discussion of services as what I think of providing a kind of a form of collective enabling or enabling of us as a group, and I suppose the argument of the first part is that we have a kind of quite a fragmented landscape of public services. The second is that the development of public services can really not just deliver for individuals and households, but provide a sense of common purpose in a very lived everyday way, and then talk about how public services linked to the broader social contract ideas about satisfaction with and trust and satisfaction with how democracy works, attitudes to immigration, and so on. Okay, so very briefly, a quick overview of Irish public services. It's notoriously difficult to compare across countries on this, so this is a little bit of a brute force and ignorance approach, but I've just taken these statistics mainly from, some of them are even a little older, but just before COVID, because really what I'm trying to look at is the overall shape of public services rather than where they're at now. And COVID the pandemic clearly has made a big difference to the levels of social spending, and then there's all these issues of cost and so on as well. But one of the things we can see overall, this is on the eve of the pandemic 2019. This gives us the overall total social expenditure from the OECD. Of course, Ireland is, impossible to compare using GDP because of our somewhat dubious numbers on that. So the Ireland star there is the total social. For all the other countries, it's total social expenditure, private and public, as a percentage of GDP, and Ireland here is 14.8 as a percentage of GDP, and here as a percentage as a percentage of GNI modified, it's 24.7. That's still lower than almost all the other countries, a little higher than the OECD average, but compared to other small open economies around Europe, it's significantly less, roughly the UK level. Now there's a lot more complicated stories to be explored underneath that, but 5% difference is very significant here. The other question is whether it actually makes sense to really just rely on GNI modified, because this figure here is like we do get tax revenue from our GDP, from our inflated GDP through corporation tax. So this is a sense in which there's a clear sense there in which we are underinvesting in our public services just at the aggregate level. What that means in practical terms in each area is a somewhat different question. Not just a question of money, but money's important. Just a couple of key other features. One is that overall, compared to the OECD, we not as high as Netherlands and United Kingdom, but we have a high level of private social spending on healthcare, education, and so on. So that's a percentage of total spending, 13% of, this is not affected by the GDP number. So this is the percentage of total spending that goes from voluntary private individuals and households, and that is higher in Ireland than it is in Austria, Belgium, Denmark, for example. We also tend to, as we know well, rely more heavily than other countries on community and voluntary sector in public services. There's a total non-profit employees as a percentage of the economically active of the total labour force. It's very difficult to compare across countries, but what we can see is Ireland's on the higher end, and the countries that are on the higher end tend to be those that have had public services provided through religious organizations. So Belgium and the Netherlands are high in part because of the segmentation of the state and politics into Catholic and Protestant organizational structures. So quite a high level, comparatively high level of private spending, comparatively high level of voluntary organization provision. And then the other thing that is interesting in light of what Kieran was talking about, and as a linking factor to the public services, is where does our, as we know well in the sense already, where does the bulk of our social welfare effort go? It goes into handling redistribution, kind of redistributing the unequal market incomes through taxes and transfers, and we tend to be on the higher end for that. But this is somewhat separate from services, but may indeed compete with it, where there's a sense in which we may be willing to provide cash, but that cash then will go into services that may or may not have been reformed or improved or whatever. Okay, so that's kind of the overall picture. The other thing just to say is that I suppose the striking feature of the kind of politics or the social politics of welfare in Ireland is not so much that support levels are low. I think if you look at the European Social Survey, they're about average, maybe clearly less than in the Nordics, for example, but not particularly lower than a lot of other countries. However, there's an interesting feature that, and this is, I understand, old data, but we don't have the survey since then. But a really striking, statistic that comes from that 2008 data is that Ireland had a very high percentage, for example, of people who believe that welfare prevents poverty, and they also believe that it makes people lazy. So obviously it's possible to hold those views, but they tend to be in tension with each other, and it was more common to hold those views together in Ireland than in other countries. So there's a kind of ambiguity. It's not that there's complete negativity towards public services or social welfare, but that there's a kind of a contradictory view, so that any support that's there is there's strong potential support, but it's still kind of quite ambiguous. So the politics of welfare and the politics of public services becomes really important in going from those kind of complex public attitudes to concrete policy provisions. Okay, so that I think it gives us a sense that we have collective services that we are underinvested in, and I think the other thing to say is that, you know, that the investment in any given year, the spending in any given year, is not simply current spending. It also accumulates as investment. We'll come on to this in a second a little bit more, but current spending is in a sense a form of investment. When we employ teachers, we employ them to provide teaching services in that year, but teachers are also, when they're employed, developing the school, developing curriculum, doing all kinds of things that are, in a sense, investment in the future, as well as the basic kind of delivering the curriculum. So the blurring of the line between, you know, there's a lot of forms of investment that come from current spending. So investment is not simply the capital expenditure on a school or whatever. But in any case, we have this fragmented landscape of collective services, high level of private provision, high involvement of community and voluntary sectors, and somewhat contradictory public attitudes. So, so then how should we think about this, this system of services? And I think I've kind of lost track of time, but I think I'm maybe about 10 minutes in, maybe something like that.
You're grand, Sean. You have another 10 easily here. Okay.
Okay, great. So then so that leads me on to the broader view, which is really how should we think about public services? And so in a sense, a lot of the time, I suppose our default is that the normal state of affairs is, you know, that the kind of default picture we have in our heads in public debate and so on is private individuals and households who are, in essence, in normal, just in everyday life, looking after themselves. And that, in a sense, public services then exist to fill deficits in that. Now, some of that is less so in like education and so on, where we kind of, you know, most people use public education, they're going through public education, but a lot of the time the additional public services are seen as meeting deficits or meeting, you know, that the government only provides these services when the market or everyday provision cannot. So in a sense, that misses a key point, which is that all individuals, leaving aside the funding or public, you know, public provision and so on, is all of us in doing anything rely enormously, with my sociological hat on the support and resources we get from others. So, you know, anybody who is building a business or, you know, having a sports career or getting ahead in education and so on, relies on a vast range of different resources, social networks, social capital, cultural enrichment, cultural capital, all these kinds of ideas. So in that sense, there's kind of all individuals are depend upon and they're empowered by the social context they're in. Now, the social context can also be a constraint on you, but society is not just a constraint, it's a key, it is probably the key enabling force or context for any individual or household or organization. So in that sense, public services is taking that idea and that insight and putting it at the center of our public policy. And that, I think if we think of it that way, then we think of public services not as providing compensation for lacks in the individual's situations, but as a broader form of collectively enabling people across the society. So that's the point that I made about individuals developing using social resources and relations, and we are building institutions to help us construct the future. When we build a school and when we have a really effective local school, that doesn't just provide education and learning for the students. It also helps to construct the future of the town or whatever it is. So in that sense, these kind of collective services they don't replace the individual or smaller services. They don't replace kind of your own pursuit of a career or particular interest or whatever it is, but they become key building blocks. And the other thing is that they're shared building blocks. So they're enabling, but they're also collectively enabling. So in that sense, they're kind of building the community. So, I'm just thinking of a couple of different examples of this. So the school, and this is where we often, when we look across the public services, we often look at services that, the classic kind of conversation is, oh, I love, service X, but the system is a mess. So in a sense, the school bus is a classic example where there's a scramble for this scarce resource of spots on the school bus. But the school bus sits in traffic. Why does the school bus sit in traffic? Because 2/3 of every town in Ireland and gets in their car between 8 and 9 to bring the kids to school. So we have a half-developed service that's competitively rationed out as a scarce resource, and at the same time is not developed to a level where it would actually transform the landscape of transport every morning between 8 and 9 and 3:30 and 4:30 or whatever it is. So in a sense, there's a massive potential there, but it requires us to rethink the nature of the nature of the service and the scale of it, and even whether we think of this as something that is a scarce resource to be rationed out to those who are facing a difficulty with transport, or whether we think of it as a form of collective enablement of the whole community, which also helps drivers, including the drivers who have to be in their car because there's fewer cars on the road. So, yeah. Another example, PLCs, which are in a sense one of the success stories of Irish society in the last 20 years. A lot of students, more and more students going to PLCs, the destigmatization of PLCs, the high success rates of students who end up in universities coming out of PLCs. So in a sense, this is kind of a hidden story of a public service that works and can be developed further. And in a sense, the importance of the PLC system is that it operates in a very kind of under the radar, everyday medium status position. So there's a huge amount of local kind of loyalty and esteem for organizations that are doing enormous work, and that in a sense don't have to be pushed up the status order, that this is part of an overall system that can just be developed out as it is at the moment. And then the other is the much maligned local hospital, and I had an experience of one last year, and the one that I was dealing with Loughlinstown, provides almost a secret public service. So there's a range of different, and what's really interesting with this hospital is that it has gone over the years, as a number of others have, from a general purpose hospital to one that provides an injury clinic, long-term care for the elderly, and a series of specialized services. So it's not trying to do everything, but what it does particularly well, but it does it in a way that is probably underdeveloped. So if we could, in a sense, that example made me think about ways that this has kind of developed in part strategically, in part through policy initiatives, but also is kind of unrecognized, and therefore probably could be developed more to really support the kinds of services that it is actually providing. And that could be worked into the built environment in terms of spaces for patients and families, could be worked into transport networks, lots of different elements to that. But again, like we're kind of locked in a debate about local versus regional versus large scale hospitals. That is probably not realistically examining the value of those institutions and how they could be not gotten rid of but reconfigured. So there's a huge potential there. There's a lot of things that are like, I think in public discourse, as I mentioned, people say, well, I like this, but the system is broken, but a lot of the time it requires new dialogue about how to reconfigure that. So we just need to kind of move beyond those binaries and like between good and bad public services. Couple here, I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail, but we sometimes think of regulation like an approach that's based on regulation and kind of punishment versus one that's based on development and support. But there's an excellent book from many years ago now by Richard Lester and Michael Piore, which is all about innovation, called innovation, but really it's about public spaces and how they foster innovation and learning in public services, in private industry, and the link between regulation and development, how they can spark off each other. I talked earlier about the other two, and I won't go on about them. The current spending is, in a sense, there's a very blurred line, especially in personally delivered social services between current spending and investment. And finally, that public services are kind of key part of how they work is empowering individuals through enriching the social fabric. And you're kind of developing that common social purpose at the same time that you're enabling individual capabilities. I won't talk about this really, but I think there's a key part to this in terms of work, which is about the public service is very strongly to a much higher level than any other sector, populated by professional workers. And the only comparable sector is probably kind of IT and high tech. So that raises all kinds of questions about work and the autonomy of professionals. And I think we have only begun to scratch the surface of how that should work. But there often is a tendency to think, what's the main kind of focus of this discussion is how can centralized bodies control the professionals that work for them. But in a sense, it's really about, I think, rethinking professional work, reconfiguring it, and especially retaining strong elements of professional autonomy and governance, but at the same time involving working on a deeper engagement with citizens. So, but that's a much broader question for another day. Very briefly, then I just want to finish with the last section, which is the broader importance of public services in the social contract. This is like hot off the presses. Late last night, I just had a look at the European Social Survey from late 2023 in Ireland. And I just looked at the correlation between people's attitudes to the state of the education system. So this is if people were positively inclined. They're asked how satisfied they were with the state of the education system in the country nowadays, and on the scale between 1 and 10. And then they were asked the same about the state of the health services, scale between 1 and 10. And then I just looked at, this is not the levels, but the relationship between, if you are happy with the state of education, are you in general more happy, more satisfied with your life as a whole? Now, this can go both ways. It's a correlation. So it's not necessarily that this is the satisfaction with public services on this side can be driven by these as well as driving them, but you can see associations. There's those who are more satisfied with these public services tend to be more satisfied with life as a whole. It is interesting that the patterns are very similar across education and health, which suggests that it's maybe not just about the specific experiences people have, but a broader sense of satisfaction. And then there's pretty strong correlations between, if you're satisfied with public services, you're satisfied with the economy, with the national government, and with how democracy works. So these are probably mutually reinforcing. But in a sense, you can see that the strength of satisfaction in public services is related to more satisfaction with the overall kind of social contract, and indeed in the controversial issues of the day, more positively inclined towards the overall impact of immigration as well, which is something we can see in a lot of the rhetoric around conflicts around migration, that there's a close link back to questions of public service. So just to end, to say, public service can help renew the social contract. This helps to chart a way to a deeper common social purpose, that it can help to anchor equality, solidarity, and democracy in everyday life. There are challenges. I saw a question there about the EU. I think I'd mention three key challenges in different levels of politics. Nationally, I think our policy impulse is to provide funds rather than to reconfigure and develop. The recent budget was very cautious on institutional changes, while at the same time giving a quite substantial amount of often one-off payments. There's all these local issues. So you might be doing a national reform which makes it good, which makes a lot of sense, but falls heavily on the local. So it's important in terms of politics to provide kind of local wins and not just kind of expect people to wait for good outcomes at the broader level. And then this European level around the challenge of the fiscal policy regime, which remains a significant issue. So I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks a million.
Great, Sean. Thanks very much. And an awful lot of food for thought there. And there's no question that the quality of public services have to be central to any new social contract. And there's an awful lot of issues that arise there. And I'm sure some of you will want to touch on that in our Q&A. Now, our next speaker, Aoife Ní Lochlin. Aoife is Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Irish Environmental Network. Her work covers the UK Withdrawal Agreement as it relates to the environment, as well as broader environmental policy and advocacy work to advance sustainable policy in Ireland on behalf of the NGO sector. She's a public policy analyst and researcher with over 13 years of experience in economic, social and environmental policy. And the title of Aoife's presentation is Making Flying Pay: Aviation and Fairness in Climate Policy.
That's great. Thank you, Chair. And first of all, thank you, Social Justice Ireland, for inviting me here today to talk about a topic which is very high up on our list of areas for reform. I'm just going to locate my presentation. Sure. There we go. Okay, so as has been mentioned, I work in policy and advocacy at the Irish Environmental Network, or Environmental Pillar, as you might know us as, which is the umbrella network organisation that represents all the national ENGOs in Ireland. So together we work across a very large range of environmental issues, from marine biodiversity and bat conservation to circular economy and climate action. But always underpinning our work, whether it's concerned with protecting our natural heritage or air quality or climate change, is a commitment to equality and fairness, citizens' environmental rights, and of course, the principle of just transition. So while environmental policy, in particular climate action, has become a greater concern for the general public over the last few years, the potential for popular backlash has never receded. And indeed, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine has provided even greater impetus behind opposition to environmental policies. So the recent battle to pass a nature restoration law in the EU, for example, is a very strong example of a concerted transnational campaign of misinformation and disinformation on key environmental policy. So this is the context, therefore, in this context, the opportunity to promote and highlight environmental policy which satisfies both polluter pays principle and a just and fair taxation system becomes even more important. One such policy area then is the thorny problem of aviation and making the polluter pay. So what I'm going to present today is a discussion of the problem and then some of the solutions that are being proposed by civil society in Ireland and across Europe. So fairness and equality in policy making. The link between climate change and inequality has been a major topic of debate over many, many years, both on a global and a national level. Carbon taxes or increased energy prices are generally understood to be regressive, given the large proportion of their incomes, lower income households spend on energy. At the same time, many of the impacts of climate change, such as increased flooding, will affect the economically vulnerable and marginalized communities disproportionately. Thus, climate policy must be developed in a way that does not exacerbate existing inequalities and preferably works to increase equality and improve quality of life for those on lower incomes. The distribution of households' carbon budgets is largely unequal, both within and between countries. A number of studies have analysed household consumption and emissions data at an EU level to show the distribution. A 2020 University of Leeds study found that at the EU level, while the top 1% of households had the highest carbon footprint and were responsible for 22 times the per capita climate targets, only 5% of EU households lived within them. Therefore, 95% of households in Europe were actually living outside of the per capita targets. The top 10% of EU households with the highest per capita footprint accounted for 27% of the EU carbon footprint, which was a higher contribution than the bottom 50%. So importantly for the topic of this presentation, air transport made up the largest proportion of the footprint of the 1% of emitting households at about approximately 40%. So the authors adopted a per capita climate target of 2.5 by 2030, consistent with the emissions pathways limiting heating to 1.5%. They then estimated the carbon footprint distribution for each EU country, the top 10%, middle 50% and bottom 50% of the population. The EU top 10% were responsible for 18.7% of emissions. The middle 40% were responsible for 43.1% and the bottom 50% were responsible for 38%. The distribution in Ireland, however, was much more concentrated in the middle, with the top 1% responsible for 18% of emissions, the middle 40% responsible for 55%, and the bottom 50% were responsible for 27% of emissions. Germany, Ireland, Greece, and Luxembourg have less than 1% of households within the per capita climate target. The authors found that air travel was the most elastic consumption in the EU at 1.5, suggesting that as total expenditure doubled, the increased spending on air travel increased by 150%. The lowest quintile, on the other hand, did not increase spending on air transport with an increase in total spending. This, according to the authors, confirms air travel as a highly carbon-intensive luxury. An ESRI 2012 paper examines the distribution of a number of pollutants across households and types, urban, rural, and household size. While the data used relates to 2006, and much has changed in terms of both policy and technology, the results are in line with the 2024 research that the poorest households emit less than the richest households. The richest decile emitting more than 4,900 tonnes than the poorest decile. Finally, a 2024 study comparing the role of income and wealth in Belgium and the UK found not only is wealth positively correlated with emissions, but that emission inequality according to wealth is higher than according to income. And people with low income and low wealth face a cumulative disadvantage. Having a distributional perspective when designing climate policies, if not all policies, is then obviously extremely important. This is just a snapshot of the literature on emissions and distribution. It generally shows that those on higher incomes have greater emissions than those on lower incomes or with lower levels of consumption. And air travel is both a high emissions and a luxury. Thus, it would make sense to tax air travel at an appropriate rate or indeed at all. So you can see from the graph here, which was created by the Transport and the Environment think tank, the trajectory of emissions in the transport sector in the EU. Growth in aviation emissions far outstrips growth in emissions in other transport modes. The growth in passenger numbers in Ireland and the wider EU reflect an understandable desire to travel, reflecting the social need to keep in touch with family and friends across the globe. However, they also reflect collective failure on behalf of governments and the EU to address emissions in the sector. In particular, through policy measures, governments are supporting the artificially low prices at the expense of the environment. At a European level, tax-free fuel, VAT-free tickets, and a legacy of free allowances under the EU emissions trading scheme have left flights undertaxed. To this can be added the subsidisation of airports and airport expansion. Aside from the EU ETS, at the UN level, efforts have focused on working through the UN's aviation agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization, to implement measures aimed at reducing the climate impact of the aviation sector. However, while tax harmonisation on aviation at the EU level has remained elusive, a number of member states have used other tax measures, such as ticket taxes and VAT on domestic flights, in order to address the problem. Aviation imposes the highest climate change costs among transportation modes. For instance, emissions per seat kilometre on short-haul flights are nearly 4 times higher in external costs than those from high-speed rail. These substantial external costs, particularly in terms of climate impact, have led to policies aimed at raising the price of air travel to help curb projected long-term growth in air traffic. For example, flights within the European Economic Area have been now included in the emissions trading system since 2012, and several European countries have introduced various flight ticket tax schemes. The key challenge to aviation as a sector is that demand-driven growth has consistently outpaced any efficiency gains, and this gap is expected to grow as further efficiency improvements become harder and harder to achieve. Addressing this imbalance requires better pricing of aviation emissions and ending the sector's significant tax incentives. Because traditional jet engines are likely to remain in service for decades, policies are essential to encourage a shift from fossil fuel jet fuel to alternatives such as sustainable aviation fuels. This shift is critical to decarbonising aviation and mitigating also its non-CO2 impacts. Yet scaling up these new fuels is a formidable task. Bio-based alternatives, for example, can compete with food and forestry. E-kerosene is perhaps more promising. It is produced from green hydrogen. However, it requires additional renewable electricity and CO2 captured from ambient air. This means that it could compete with other sectors for share of renewable energy. Despite some progress, the shift isn't happening fast enough. Fully decarbonising aviation with e-kerosene would demand immense amounts of renewable electricity, likely unachievable in the near term. According to Transport and the Environment, if unchecked sector growth continues, passenger demand alone could consume up to 24% of Europe's renewable electricity by 2050. Additionally, aviation's non-CO2 effects may have an even greater impact than its CO2 emissions, further demonstrating the urgency of accelerating this transition. So managing flight demand is absolutely crucial for advancing decarbonisation in aviation. Cumulative emissions drive global warming, and the aviation sector therefore cannot delay emissions reductions until alternative fuel supplies are scaled up in the late 2030s and 2040s. Again, estimations by think tanks show that if aviation traffic continues to grow as projected, an additional 1 gigaton of CO2 will be released into the atmosphere, compared to a scenario where demand is actively managed, even if full decarbonisation is achieved by 2050. In the case of Ireland, you can see from the graphs growth in emissions from air transport 2019 to 2023. Despite the pandemic, 2023 saw nearly 40 million people use Irish airports, which was the highest number on record, and causing Ireland's consumption of jet kerosene to increase by 15%. Clearly, with no policy action, demand will continue to rise. So what is the current state of play in terms of taxation and aviation? And why is pricing pollution in the aviation sector so important? First of all, eliminating subsidies and price gaps with other less damaging modes of transport or with clean fuels will have a behavioural impact. It would incentivise the use of cleaner fuels and decrease demand, thereby decreasing emissions. It should also drive fuel efficiency and new aircraft technologies, encouraging airlines to invest more in more fuel-efficient aircraft. Equally important, however, is the contribution it would make to social and environmental justice. As I discussed earlier, higher income and wealthier households contribute disproportionately to emissions. Bridging the price gap would satisfy the polluter pays principle. The options for pricing exist at both an EU and a member state level. So removing the jet fuel exemption. Member states can actually already move the exemption on taxing jet fuel for domestic flights or bilateral extra EU flights with countries where there are no air service agreements stipulating exemptions. However, to date, no member state has opted to do so. The revision of the Energy Taxation Directive under the Green New Deal includes the removal of the exemption of the intra-EU level, along with other fossil fuel subsidies. This proposal is currently making its way through the process and is unfortunately subject to much opposition from some member states. It includes, amongst other measures, minimum levels of taxation to be applied gradually on jet fuels, set at €10.75 per gigajoule or 0.38 per litre by 2033. Intra-EU cargo flights will continue to be exempted. Existing ASAs or service agreements complicate the picture. The EU has included fuel exemptions in ASAs with the EU and Canada, for example, which means that it cannot require airlines from these countries to pay tax on fuel bought within the EU. However, more recently negotiated ASAs do not have this exemption, and the EU could seek to renegotiate ASAs where the exemption currently exists. While the revised Energy Tax Directive has not yet completed its passage through the institutions, it has been critiqued for its 10-year gradual application of the minimum level of tax on jet fuels. Environmental campaigners have also argued that if the proposals do not gain the needed unanimity at EU level, that willing member states should enter into bilateral agreements with each other to tax jet fuel, as it is currently allowed under the Energy Tax Directive. So the EU ETS. Well, European airlines have been members of the European Union Emissions Trading System since 2012, while the past few years have seen the carbon price increase in the system since its reform in 2018. A number of factors mean that its system hasn't been as effective as it could have been in addressing emissions from aviation. First of all, only intra-EU flights were included due to pressure from some countries and from industry. This more narrow scope has meant that only 40% of aviation's EU emissions were included, and some of the EU's largest airlines do not pay for 70% of their emissions. In addition, the original poor design of the system created an oversupply of credits in previous years. Airlines also still receive some of their allowances for free. In 2019, airlines got nearly half of their required emissions permits for free, which amounted to a €900 million subsidy. For the system to fully account for the cost of pollution, the scope must be expanded to include all flights. So finally, the VAT exemption. The VAT directive permits EU member states to exempt passenger transport from VAT under specific conditions, allowing for reduced rates or a zero VAT rate. All member states apply a zero VAT rate to international air travel, creating price distortions between it and other transportation modes. In contrast, a majority of countries impose VAT on domestic air tickets, either at a reduced or standard VAT rate. The loss of revenue to EU member states is significant, with one estimation putting the loss at €17 billion for both intra-EU and extra-EU flights at a harmonised rate of 15%. In place of VAT, a number of member states have opted to apply ticket charges. So here you can see a list of the ticket charges that are currently in place in the EEA and EU zone. Currently, 8 countries apply a form of ticket tax. Denmark will become the 9th country to do so in 2025. pledging that the revenue will help finance the green transition. 6 of the countries applied different rates depending on the distance travel. And this is obviously in line with polluter pays, because as mentioned, longer distance flights have a greater impact on emissions. And this is not just due to the extra carbon emitted, but it's also due to the non-CO2 carbon impacts that are actually greater at higher altitudes. So 2 of the countries in the table also apply special rates to chartered non-commercial flights. And this is another important equity. And you can see there the United Kingdom has a special rate for chartered non-commercial flights, as does Portugal. However, while the increasing number of countries applying a ticket tax is good news, a small number of countries, including Ireland, have removed existing taxes. Malta was first. It removed its tax following a ruling by the European Commission that the tax was discriminatory, as it only applied to flights leaving the island. Ireland had a passenger tax between 2009 and 2014, when it was abolished following lobbying by the industry and the publication of a report commissioned by the industry. Numerous studies have examined the effect of aviation taxes. I'm sorry, I can see some of the responses to recent responses by industry to the initiation of ticket taxes in Denmark, the increase of tax hikes in Germany, and then the abolition of the tax in Sweden. So you can see there Ryanair is retaliating against Germany's tax hikes by slashing routes and cutting 1.8 million seats. So the power of industry in this sector really cannot be overstated. So numerous studies of aviation taxes on of aviation taxation. The literature generally finds that aviation taxes lead to a decrease in passenger numbers, indicating a negative price elasticity of demand. However, some studies explore the broader economic or secondary impacts of aviation taxation. A 2021 ESRI paper investigated the impact of 5 scenarios: the abolition of free allowances in the ETS in 2026, the introduction of VAT by 2030, a passenger tax of €16, the abolition of the kerosene tax exemption, and the abolition of the kerosene tax exemption plus the ETS improvements. The main results show that a gradual implementation of taxation does lead to lower impacts on the sector and the economy. Direct taxation of carbon inputs through the abolition of the tax exemption plus the ETS improvements had the highest impact on emissions of nearly 15%, but with a 0.6% decrease in GDP. The latter option was also the most cost effective. However, in terms of household impacts, the study found that while impacts were small, 0.2% in household wage income due to aviation taxation, they were regressive. Specific households will face unemployment. In terms of real disposable income, the result was opposite. The impact was progressive, with richer households more negatively impacted. Thus, the result really underlines the need for just transition strategies in impacted sectors. At the European level, the Environment and Transport think tank have modelled a price of €165 per tonne by 2030 on all European aviation emissions, including flights departing from Europe, not included by the EU ETS. By 2030, they calculated that 85% of the abatement would come from demand management and pricing measures. The role of business travel will be especially important, with a reduction in business travel representing half the emissions savings. As part of this model, they included a business travel cap and an end to airport expansion in Europe. Thus, taxation measures coupled with regulation is likely to yield the best results. And addressing the frequent flyer. So reducing corporate travel does present a genuine opportunity to lower demand. The pandemic demonstrated that although people missed the social connections associated with flying, corporate and business travel could largely be replaced, by alternative methods of working. Managing demand is no more off limits. The IEA notes that even a modest reduction in flights, just 12%, could cut emissions by up to 50%. A business travel cap or frequent flyer measure has been suggested by think tanks as a way of reducing the demand from cooperative travel. The New Economics Foundation analysis showed that households with incomes over 100,000 per year are 6 times more likely to take 3 or more return flights annually compared to those with incomes below 20,000 pounds. Additionally, nearly 70% of households in the lowest income group do not fly at all in a given year, while only about 20% of the highest income households forgo flying annually. The frequent flyer levy proposed by the NEF applies a tax to each flight an individual takes, with the rate increasing incrementally after every 2 single flights or 1 round trip. So this approach supports the green transition, they argue, in 3 ways. It can reduce aviation emissions by achieving significant short to medium term reductions in emissions, providing the necessary cuts that technology cannot at this time meet. Their policy model suggests that if implemented in 2028, it could reduce European aviation carbon emissions by 21%. Protecting low-income flyers. So this levy allows infrequent, lower-income passengers to continue flying while managing overall air traffic and ensuring that those who pollute more pay more. It leaves taxes unchanged for 72% of Europe's population. Higher income households, so those earning over 100,000, are 4 times more likely to pay the levy than those earning below 20,000. The majority of emissions reductions, so 54%, are expected to come from individuals who would otherwise take 4 or more return flights per year. This is a group of residents that only represents 4.5% of the Western European population. And finally, raising funds for a greener economy. The frequent flyer levy could generate significant revenue to support Europe's transition to a fairer, greener economy. The policy model estimates that 63.6 billion in additional tax revenue could be raised across Europe. So in conclusion, there are clear environmental and fairness reasons to tax air travel. And while most of the possible options currently available to government are not perfect, they do provide a price signal and increased revenue to fund the transition. Is there any indication, however, that the current government has any plan to address the price gap? Unfortunately, I haven't read any of the published manifestos yet, so perhaps some parties are considering this question. However, if you look at the 2 important climate policy documents, the Climate Action Plan and Ireland's Integrated National Energy and Climate Plan 2021 to 2030, you will not see demand measures included in the list of policy options. The current government is pinning its hopes on alternative fuels. However, as has been pointed out by many experts, there will be a gap of at the very least a decade and probably more before sustainable aviation fuels or electrification can replace the current use of fossil fuels in the industry. In a time where environmental policies, in particular taxation measures, risk provoking a backlash across the continent and here in Ireland, greater taxation of air travel could demonstrate not just a commitment to emissions reduction, but a commitment to fairness and a just transition. A 2023 poll by IEN member Friends of the Irish Environment showed that 55% of the Irish public believe that airplane fuel should be taxed as much as fuel for any other mode of transport, with only 9% strongly disagreeing. Support for heavily taxing private jets was overwhelming, with 79% agreeing and only 5% disagreeing. Kerosene subsidies cost the state €553 million in 2022. And the effective tax rate was €26 per tonne, compared with €220 per tonne for petrol. The climate impact of air travel is largely driven by wealthy Europeans and wealthy Irish people. A European think tank estimated that if everyone globally flew as much as the richest 10% of Europeans, aviation would produce 23 gigatons carbon per year, about 2/3 of global CO2 emissions in 2019. For the sake of fairness and climate, it's time for Europe and its member states to take concerted action to reduce demand. Thank you.
Aoife, thank you very much for that. Very interesting, and I think something we can all relate to. And I'm sorry, but I couldn't help but introduce at this point somebody who's very topical in the news at the moment, which is Mr. O'Leary, whom I recall in an RTE interview, it's only about 5 or 6 years ago, where he suggested that climate change was not a real phenomenon. I think he has since moderated his views, but I would I would suggest that perhaps he'd be choking on his own emissions at such a presentation, because it does not accord very well with the bottom line for Ryanair, which seems to be the precise element of science that drives all Mr. O'Leary's exhortations on this subject. We'll have a few questions, Aoife, for you on that at our Q&A, which is just after our next speaker, who is Matthew Donoghue. Matthew is an assistant professor of social policy in the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice in UCD. His research interests include social citizenship and social rights, the politics and ideology of welfare state, resilience and integration, and participation. The title of Matthew's paper is Enhancing Participation in Local Democracy, Opportunities and Challenges via Public Participation Networks. And over to you, Matthew.
Well, thanks very much, Mick, for the introduction, and thanks to Social Justice Ireland for inviting me to speak today. I'll just share my screen with you all. Okay, yeah, so hopefully you can all see the screen. So today I'm going to talk about a kind of a small funded research project funded by the Irish Research Council, enhancing participation in local democracy, focusing in particular on the kind of the dynamics and the role of public participation networks in kind of developing, I suppose, a form of deliberative democracy. So I'll kind of take you over the project very briefly, talk a little bit about the rationale for doing the research, how we went about the research, and then some preliminary findings and some potential recommendations and takeaways. So as I said, this is a small project funded by the Irish Research Council's New Foundations programme. The aim of this programme is to connect scholarly research with, organisations in the public sphere. So for this project, I partnered with Social Justice Ireland, which, as you will know, have a long tradition of kind of working with and on public participation networks. And this was a qualitative study, so there's quite a lot of research which is kind of more quantitative and statistical in nature, looking at public participation networks, as well as some qualitative research. But what we tried to do was provide some more in-depth case studies of particular public participation networks, as I'll talk about in a second, as well as a slightly more broad overview. So we wanted to talk to kind of members of PPNs themselves, so the community organisations, the charities and so on that actually engage in the PPN structures, as well as the support staff and the organisational staff that actually run the PPNs on a day-to-day basis and liaise with organisations and local authorities and sometimes central government. And we also wanted to try and bring in the voices and the experiences and the perspectives of other stakeholders, particularly kind of different levels. So we talked to TDs, we talked to councillors, and we talked to people who currently or previously had advisory roles with certain PPNs. Excuse me. So why do this study? So public participation networks came about in around 2014. So we're kind of at the 10-year anniversary of them now. And the aim broadly of PPNs was to kind of help localize policymaking, help localize democracy, give more organizations, give more social groups, and ultimately try and give individuals more of a say, particularly about what was happening in their local communities, to try and increase transparency and accountability. So in an ideal situation, PPNs should enhance local democracy. And the aim of these has been to try and develop some form of deliberative democracy. So I've kind of defined this as empowering stakeholders to influence decision-making at the local level. The really key element here, I think, is giving, well, as a kind of the Department for Rural and Community Development put it, giving communities more of a voice. So actually trying to give charities and community organizations a direct say in how policy is made, what the policy priorities should be. And I'll talk about some tensions, but one of the big tensions is that kind of historically Ireland is has a very centralized system when it comes to politics and policy making. This is one of the reasons we see PPNs developed, to try and decentralize this slightly. But the idea is to give communities more of a voice. We are able to make democracy stronger, allowing more diverse views and interests to be considered as part of the decision-making process of local government. So it's also trying to give local government and local authorities a stronger mandate, maybe, for certain policy decisions, more legitimacy, more transparency as well. So as you can probably tell, PPNs are important. They can occupy a very important and significant space in the local democracy area. But there has been research done that show there are areas for improvement. So the Mazars consultancy company did some research commissioned by the Department of Rural and Community Development, and they found there were 5 areas where PPNs could work, but also where there was areas for improvement. So looking at kind of how PPNs are governed locally and nationally, communication. So how do you communicate the role or the actions of PPNs? How do you communicate their existence? Coordination, training and staffing. And then a Social Justice Ireland report in 2021 kind of pointed out that whilst the principles of PPNs, these things around deliberative democracy, are being implemented, and there is genuine dialogue taking place, the Social Justice Ireland report felt that this has fallen short of developing a genuine partnership between community groups and local authorities via PPNs. So one of the aims of the PPNs was to act as this kind of conduit between grassroots organizations and local authorities, trying to make local authorities more accessible, trying to make this the development of local policy making more accessible and more deliberative. So although this kind of has happened, it may not have happened to the extent that was originally envisaged. And I should say this despite significance being made by many PPNs across the country, and also some consistent improvement in some cases as well. So if you look back at some of the previous reports, you can see that some PPNs tend to be more successful than others, and there's lots of kind of variables around this, some of which I kind of will mention as the presentation goes on. So just to quickly talk about the approach we took. So like I said, it was a small project. Really, it was kind of intended, or it is still intended as it's still ongoing, as kind of a scoping exercise to try and look in depth at a few cases to then work out kind of next stages for maybe kind of broader research or how to complement existing research that's already going on. Unlike a lot of research in this area, we drew on an approach called interpretive policy analysis. So this is where we would kind of prioritize more, I suppose, individual perspectives or community perspectives, group perspectives, try and work out what we might call shared typical responses or shared typical positions, but also really emphasizing the role of politics and dialogue in the policy-making process. So we wouldn't necessarily say here's a kind of a problem that is kind of existing out in the wild somewhere, and then we will kind of just linearly go find a solution to that problem. The problem itself is problematized and constructed in a certain way, and we have to understand how we got there. We have to understand how the different organizations and different actors and stakeholders interact. So we would argue, taking this kind of approach, the political evidence or evidence in general is contestable. It can be constructed in different ways. And so we have to kind of make a choice about what we want to look at. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to look at people's own perspectives in engaging with these organizations. And in doing so, we are privileging their experience and their perceptions and the voices of actors. So moving away, I suppose, from the broad level or aggregated understanding and analysis of these, looking at kind of more individualized experiences and how we might be able to relate that back to the whole. So we would argue that this approach is particularly useful for understanding the deliberative nature of PPNs, or at least the potentially deliberative nature of PPNs in an ideal sense, whilst accounting for the different actors and the different stakeholders' views and perspectives. So we looked at kind of 2 case studies of 2 PPNs, and I should say at this point, kind of in the name of anonymity, I won't be kind of mentioning which PPN areas they were or who we interviewed, so we can try and maintain some kind of anonymity. I would say that kind of given the small nature of the project, looking at fewer areas meant we could kind of go into more detail. Our original intention was to look at 4 PPN areas, as well as having kind of the more national participants. And the aim here was to interview resource workers and support workers, so they're kind of the backbone of the PPN's organization. We also aim to have focus groups with people who interact with PPNs, so members of the community groups, of the charities and the grassroots organizations and so on. And then we also thought it was important to have interviews with other stakeholders who would have different perspectives coming from different angles. So, for example, a TD, a counsellor, a consultant, for example, who would have different experiences of engaging with PPNs. And one of the main reasons we did this was so we could compare these different perspectives. And the idea is, if we are finding, say, commonalities and common themes from, coming from the support workers and the resource workers, from the stakeholders who engage with PPNs, and then TD counsellors and consultants, we can say with a fairly higher level of confidence that we would expect to find these things happening in other PPNs, or we could, expect to see them as general problems. That gives us a jumping off point for doing future research. So as I said, the original intention was to collect more data from more sources, but we found quite early on that we kind of had some problems with access and availability. Now, in one way, this leads into a core finding that many people expressed a lot of interest, particularly the PPN kind of organization members themselves, expressed a lot of interest in joining focus groups, but they just didn't have the time. They weren't able to join at the times we were able to do it. And there's an issue here of kind of time poverty, that these organizations are already stretched. It also happened to be the case that we were kind of awarded this grant and were doing the research in the end of a local election cycle. So councillors weren't going to be speaking to us until after the election, and the PPNs themselves and the organisations engaging with the PPNs had other competing pressures. There was also competing research we found out from the department itself, which we were told was causing a slight bit of confusion. So again, that might have kind of impacted on kind of uptake of our own research. So just to say, the analysis is still ongoing. We're still going through our transcripts. We've got kind of hundreds of pages of data we kind of need to work through. So the findings and recommendations I'm going to talk about on the next couple of slides. I would like you to treat them as preliminary, as tentative, and as subject to change. But hopefully you can kind of see some of the themes that are coming up. So what we found was that a lot of the barriers and the sticking points identified in the 2 main reports on PPNs, they still remain, and they were still coming up and being very prominent in a lot of our interviews with our stakeholders. The interesting thing, I suppose, is this is despite focus from the Department of Rural and Community Development on improving kind of the operation of PPNs, the efficiency and the effectiveness of PPNs, and working out how they can have greater impact in the local policy-making area. And this includes their own consultations and their own research on PPNs. And I mean, the other thing to say is that we got a sense from some of our participants that there may have been a slight bit of kind of research fatigue kicking in. So this is basically where, if you work in an organization and lots of people want to interview you, want to kind of use you in their research, it gets quite tiring saying the same things over and over again, especially if you feel like what you're saying kind of isn't coming through. So that might have also explained slightly some of our access issues. But the findings we have to kind of present to you today can be broken down kind of into following themes. So structural, broadly agential issues, and broadly kind of resource-based issues. So to think about some of the structural issues, and I should say I use these terms structural, agential, and resource-based as quite large umbrella terms, just to help organize our thoughts. So one really important finding was that PPNs find themselves in kind of a nexus point really between so many different priorities, and inevitably some of these priorities are going to be competing. So whereas in the ideal sense, PPNs, should be a conduit for deliberative democracy, for enhancing local participation in democracy and local policy making, in increasing connections between local authorities and grassroots organizations, a lot of the time we found that PPNs may end up kind of acting as a kind of community organizing hubs. And in some ways, this is obviously part of their remit, but it does mean that some of those priorities ended up being emphasized over, say, priorities around getting involved in the local policymaking process. And in some cases, and I'll talk about this later, this is partly to do as well with the PPN's relationship with the local authority in kind of whatever part of the country. But what we did find was a lot of PPNs and people who engage with PPNs were kind of focusing on things like identifying opportunities for grants for charities and so on, and giving grant writing support, publicizing organizations in the local area, publicizing activities, publicizing kind of basically what these community organizations are doing. And although that is clearly a really important element of these organizations, it's not necessarily the primary role that PPNs were set up to do. So this could reduce the room for influence on policy making at the local level because of the, and I'll talk about this later, the quite restricted nature of resources available to PPNs. And because of these competing priorities, and because obviously every community organization, every grassroots organization, charity or so on, or local policy organization will have slightly different needs, slightly different agendas, strategies and priorities, it can be quite difficult to get these organizations' needs to line up with PPN's remit. Some organizations may be understandably and justifiably much more concerned with finding options for funding so they can continue their work rather than directly engaging with the local policy-making process. We also found from multiple participants that there have been attempts to set up more meaningful national coordination. So PPNs obviously work in their own counties and the local authorities. And there is some form of diffuse national network, but there have been kind of conversations with PPNs and various other kind of local and national organizations about having some kind of more centralized structure, but this has never really materialized, despite, at least in our research, it being a popular idea. So attempts to set up this kind of national coordination structure have faced quite a lot of barriers and difficulty. And this is one of the things that a number of our participants were quite enthusiastic about, kind of having this kind of national coordination structure, because it was an opportunity to share resources, to share best practice, to share kind of training materials, briefing materials, and that could be for the PPN organizers and resource workers. It could be for PPN members who sit on strategic policy committees that I'll mention later, about engaging with local authorities, even briefings for local authority workers themselves and TDs and councillors to find the best ways to engage with and liaise with these public participation networks, so both groups can kind of bring out the best in one another. Now, some of these situations were out of the PPN's control. So depending on the local authority. So in some local authorities, you may only have one person who's kind of charged with liaising with PPNs. In some places, there may be more. In other places, still, there may be nobody because there's a vacancy, for example. Or, there may be different issues with funding. Some local authorities are more willing to provide financial support to their PPNs. Local authority workers and local councillors and so on may have a more enthusiastic or dimmer view of the role of PPNs. Some may see it as duplicating work. Some may see it as stepping on councillors' toes. Others may see it as a really good community resource and a way to engage with the local community in a much more systematic way. So it can really depend on where you are in the country and the kind of people you have around you, and the ability to make those connections and develop those working relationships. So I'll have a couple of quotes as I go through. Some of these will look like a wall of text, so apologies for that, but I will kind of talk through them. So this is kind of a quote we had drawn from a discussion we had with someone who had worked with various PPNs at various points in their career, in a kind of an advisory role or a consultancy role, helping PPNs kind of set themselves up, helping PPNs recover from a particular issue that had damaged the PPN's organization or something like that. And so what this person said was, what's really frustrating is that their common challenges. So the challenges that this person had seen in the various PPNs they'd worked with were common to all the PPNs. Now, the same challenges, no matter where you go, no matter what context you're working in, they haven't changed in 10 years. So that suggests something fundamental about either the kind of the construction of the PPNs, or the relationship between PPNs and, say, local authorities, or even the government's approach to providing resources or regulating or governing or supporting PPNs. And this person says, I've had this conversation multiple times with the departments of Community and Rural Development, talking about long-term planning for PPNs. And the conversation always starts with this person, apart from a centralized national structure, what can we do? And I'm like, the most basic solution, the one that would make the biggest impact, is the one that you're not willing to do. So that kind of clearly speaks to some kind of structural impasse. You could argue it has something to do as well with the nature of local and central politics in Ireland. It could be an attempt to keep PPNs local. The fear being that if there's a centralized national structure, is that going to kind of bring them into central government more, give central government more control? But it's something that PPNs themselves have been asking for. And it's something that the department doesn't seem to be willing to do. So this is a discussion with a former councillor, so someone who's recently finished being councillor, reflecting on kind of what PPNs are, what their role is or should be, and tensions around kind of central and local structures, how PPNs are funded or how things are funded in general, really, and how these things should be organised. So the councillor was reflecting on this and said, I think they call like the role they could play, if PPNs are the future, if the local authorities are going to remain in kind of funding control of that space, of the local policy space, the local democracy space, and the community development space. It's not a bad thing if they actually do allow more natural and organic growth in the community sector itself, and challenging kind of more resistant political work, rather than this kind of, everyone has to row in, and there's a consensus approach to how communities engage with PPNs. And they remark that, I think the PPN structure is good. In a sense, it could provide supports. And I like that. I could organise and provide funding for communities to do things. But I think it itself is not the good driving body of that kind of participatory democracy. Because I think people perceive as it coming from the top down, which is kind of the opposite of what participatory democracy is. It should be coming from the bottom up. So this councillor, reflecting on their own engagements with PPNs, and probably their engagements with community organisations and, say, activists and so on, who engage with the PPNs themselves, there may be some kind of scepticism, perhaps, around, well, what position do PPNs hold? And this is actually one of the issues around it kind of being outside of the PPN's control. We know that PPNs have really committed staff, really enthusiastic staff, and they are trying to do this job by bringing groups from different levels together. But there may still be skepticism from both sides around kind of the role and the limits of PPNs. So to move from some broadly structural to some broadly agential findings, as I just mentioned, it's very clear from everybody we talk to, and the kind of the grey literature out there on PPNs, that these public participations have committed, enthusiastic staff and officials. And in some cases, there are really enthusiastic and committed members of local authorities, but not in every case. But the participants in our study emphasised a number of challenges. So a really major one that came up without fail almost immediately when we started talking about these things was time pressures. So every resource worker, every support worker would talk about the significant goodwill hours that were required to do the job, often with little recognition. And this was strongly linked to the fact that both these positions had numerous jobs in one role, and we could argue they had too many jobs to do in one role. And a quote I'm going to show you in a minute really, I think, emphasizes that. But the compounding factor is that these men, like different jobs, also had competing pressures and competing foci. So you on any given day you might be kind of dealing with the social media and the kind of the PR essentially of the PPN, trying to run campaigns, trying to organize campaigns, trying to get them off the ground, trying to keep them going. Also helping to organize members. So, organizing meetings, getting PPN members together, finding members to sit on strategic policy committees and so on for the local authority, helping firefight any problems. As we said before, helping organizations find money and grants, helping them write the grants. These two people or one person would also have to do the accounts for the PPN. They would have to check in with local authorities. They do all these things almost simultaneously. They advocate for groups. They engage with the political actors. They do the finance management. They do the project management. They do the person management. So it's a significant amount of work. And the other kind of potential issue is that the success of PPNs in our research was in some cases quite strongly linked to the working relationships with the local authorities and their staff. So we can make the argument that the most successful PPNs are the ones that have the most supportive local authorities, which seems like an obvious point. But if you think about the ambition that PPNs could be, mostly independent organizations that act as liaisons between local authorities and community groups to enhance local democracy and public policy making, it's quite an important point that the attitude of the local authority to the PPN can really enable or constrain the success and the efficiency and the efficacy of PPNs. And it's also clear that the PPN members themselves, so the organizations that engage the PPN, their participation is crucial. It's absolutely central to the longevity of the PPN. But there's often a lack of clarity on the roles, the goals, and the processes of PPNs and the various mechanisms within the PPNs that the members are getting involved with. And this could be, if you have an activist, for example, who gets involved with a strategic policy committee, they may be really good at advocating on the street or in other forums the needs of their organization, but it might not work, to a room full of councillors, for example. So it's about finding the right person. It's about, being able to train that person up as well, and really to make sure that everybody who's involved, all the stakeholders, have a really clear sense of what their role is, what the division of labor is. And that's not always evident in what we saw. So again, a big wall of text. So this is a discussion with a PPN resource worker and a PPN support worker, discussing their roles and how to approach this job. And some elements of here we think could be an example of best practice, for example. But a resource worker remarked to us that what they do essentially. So it's the usual PPN stuff: information provision, making connections, engagement, administration of the organization, the policy development, the finances, the reporting. And then for the members, so their role in engaging with members, outreach, training, support, and policy submissions. And this resource worker said, I would probably do more submissions, write more submissions than the support worker. So we work in partnership on a lot, the resource worker and the support worker. We really do, even though we don't physically work beside each other, we work in partnership on a lot of stuff. So we've got something this year we've kind of developed to try and work a bit more strategically, and each of us not kind of getting pulled into everything. So they're really trying to kind of compartmentalize what they do. Otherwise, they'd both be doing everything. They'd unwittingly be duplicating work, being much less efficient and taking too much time. So a lot of the communication, a lot of that may be going to a bit more contact with the actual groups, with the membership. And then we both attend secretaries and we work with secretaries. The support worker also said that it might be worth saying that when the department decided to fund the support work, so kind of bring in a new role to help PPNs, a lot of PPNs seem to go down the administrative support kind of way. Whereas in this PPN we were talking to, we from the get-go thought, no, we need to have someone who'd be more like this particular support worker. They'd be able to do some admin, but they'd also be doing a bit of development and engagement work as well. So we approached the local authority in which they were based, and they said, look, this is what we want to do. The department money we're getting isn't really going to cover this. Can the local authority give us some extra money so we can actually hire somebody who can do this work and engage in the way that we need them to?
5 minutes, Mark.
Okay, thanks. And this local authority was supportive, and they did. So they also say, you know, still not a massive wage. So this really shows as well, engaging with local authorities is really important. So some resource-based. Unsurprisingly, you know, the lack of resources was really well represented in the research, financial, time-based, and knowledge. And we've already mentioned that people really felt time poor, which is corroborated by the outside perspectives from TDs, counsellors, and consultants. And people just didn't have time to properly dedicate to this job. And multiple stakeholders mentioned or emphasized the need for some kind of stipend. For example, to allow members to attend things in the day where they might have to kind of, you know, take time off their own job, so they're compensated for that, as well as then money towards training to, you know, have the kind of the more specific political and policy-based training they might need. So really emphasizing the importance of tailored training and the sharing of best practice. So a TD reflecting, and I'm almost done here, but they say the local authority level is where the rubber hits the road. It's where things are executed and implemented. And this TD was saying what you really need is someone to sit on these strategic policy committees, so like environment or disability or local area, and really just have an agenda they're going to hammer every single time. You know, and if you have a strong chair who wants to drive agendas and is willing to listen, that's key to it. And that's outside the control of the PPN. And we see a lot of churn. We see a lot of PPN members going onto these things and finishing up after a year or 2 years and somebody else coming in. And then you don't have the continuity. It can be difficult because those SPC meetings are during normal working hours, whereas these are volunteers. And it can be difficult when you have so many different organizations that you're trying to represent at that table as well. So I think that's where the training comes in. Prior to going onto an SPC, it would be very helpful for the PPN member to get a briefing, a good briefing now to say, look, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to feel unlistened to at times, and also to give people the particular kind of diplomatic, deliberative, and kind of policy relevant skills that they would need to be able to sit on these committees and make a real difference. So some recommendations just to conclude, I suppose. Again, we can look at these in agential, structural, and resource-based ways. But there's a need to kind of focus on relationship development. And I'm sorry, I'll rush through this a little bit. But really, there should be a focus on all local authorities providing comparable support across the country. So staff, resources, experience, and political will. Also increasing targeted financial support, so stipends for PPN members, for example. And really emphasizing the importance of training and briefings. So particularly around expectation management as well, understanding the processes of the local authorities, clarity on individual roles and the limits of the possible. So what you can actually achieve in whatever time frame you have. Maybe there's an opportunity here to examine overlap and differentiation of roles and tasks internally and externally. So within the PPN, how to divide labor like we saw in the example, but then externally as well, you know, possibility of funding additional staff positions. So we had some of these PPN organizers say it would be lovely to have, for example, a dedicated social media officer, for example. And really then kind of highlighting the importance of joined up governance, having some kind of national centralized PPN organization to share the resources, to share best practice and governance strategies. So just to briefly sum up, public participation networks clearly remain an important conduit in local democracy and local policy making, but these PPNs still face barriers and struggles on various levels that negatively impact their efficacy and their effectiveness, and they've been around since the beginning of the development of PPNs. Not all of these are within control of the PPNs, which means we do need more of a joined up approach between different levels of government and different stakeholders that combines these skills and experiences. PPNs face agential, structural, and resource-based challenges that often overlap, but these can be overcome, I would argue, with cooperation, political and procedural support, planning and management. So thanks very much. Thanks for listening.
Matthew, thank you very much, and very interesting. And already, just to let you know, and everyone, we have that we've already had a communication from a former PPN worker, and a current PPN worker, who said that very great for the presentation to see the work being validated, which is something that does not happen, as we know, very often in some instances. One quick thing, Matthew, while you're there, I just want to, just another thing we have from one of our audience today. I just want to make a small comment as a former PPN worker. The Mazars report was not received well by those working within the sector, as those recommendations were received as intention to increase surveillance and control without addressing the need for enhanced communication, engagement and accountability that would facilitate meaningful public participation and resources for operation. I don't know, do you want to comment on that at all, Matthew?
I can comment briefly. Yeah, I agree. I'm aware of that. And I think one of the interesting things about a lot of the PPN research that's been done on a central level is, at least from people we talked to, was that people felt like there was just more and more research and people weren't being listened to. Their kind of recommendations and worries and fears weren't ending up in these final reports. And it's also kind of, I think, shows this tension between local government and central government in a highly centralized system. That the ostensible aim is to have more transparency and participation at the local level, but the central kind of government structure wants to maintain some kind of oversight and potentially control. So yes, and this is actually one of the reasons we want to do this independent research as well, to make sure that we can have a more diverse range of voices in kind of our research reports.
And one other quick one for you. To point out here that, as you mentioned, the policy making is so centralized in this country. Would there be any benefit in reforming government's relationship with PPNs so that they're given a role in engaging with government departments and agencies in addition to local authorities?
I mean, the short answer, I think, would be yes. One of the things we wanted to do with this research, I think it's for further research now, is to try and work out or strategize, is there a way to translate what's happening at this local level more efficiently to the national level, to the central level with the PPNs. But again, I think it comes down to, again, a little bit to this tension between local and central government in such a highly centralized system, where up until very recently, historically, the central government still makes the policy essentially, and it's local government that implements the policy. And so unless we can kind of reform that relationship a little bit and have a bit more feedback and a little bit more bottom-up approaches, it's going to be hard to do so. But again, I think that's why PPNs are so important, because it's a conduit and it's a springboard for local organizations to be able to actually articulate their views and, dare I say, kind of agitate more. And this has to happen more, just at the end of the election cycle, like we're seeing now, for example.
Yeah, I can well imagine that. Thanks for that, Matthew. Just folks, just to point out, and I mentioned this at the beginning of proceedings today, but just for those who may not have been here, as you may be aware, Sive O'Neill was due to give a presentation. Unfortunately, Sive was a witness in a court case that had been moved, and it was moved again, and she could not avoid it today and being absent, but her paper will be available later when all of them are on the Social Justice Ireland website. So that was unfortunate absence today, but and I think she was very disappointed she wasn't able to make it herself, as we were that she wasn't, but that's the way things go. I have a question here for Aoife, and I should say, I suppose, everyone in our panel, anybody who wants to chime in here, please do, because some of these are not necessarily specific to the research area and maybe worth a different perspective. But Aoife, one question here. The widespread resistance to taxation of aviation fuel is driven by concern about the cost being passed on to consumers and the risk of making the aviation financially unsustainable. But have we any sense of the level of profit being made by airlines and whether they can absorb the cost of tax on carbon?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure about the answer to that in terms of the airline's capacity to absorb the cost. I suppose what one of the aims of increased taxation is actually to reduce demand. So we are in a bind here. I mean, I think that's kind of obvious from all of the data. We have a problem. We cannot decarbonize air travel quickly enough in terms of there are no, unlike, let's say, road transport, where we can, you know, try and expedite the transition to electric vehicles. We can put money into, you know, increasing the charging network. It's actually, it's not that simple with air transport. And there is a lot of, I suppose, questions around to what extent and when sustainable alternative fuels or you know, electrification will be able to make any kind of inroads into the industry. We really need to be, I suppose, reducing our emissions by quite a lot in the next 10 to 15 years if we are going to reach, well, I mean, I don't know if we will be, if we're going to reach our targets, and if, you know, the world is going to manage to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. It might demand, you know, if we say to one sector, well, we'll put you on the long finger, then the other sectors have to pick up the slack. So, you know, that might actually be the choice that's made, but then we will have to look at other sectors to see where they, you know, where they can input. And every, you know, nearly every, it's unfortunate when you're working on climate policy, but nearly every policy has an impact on somebody. So carbon tax obviously has an impact, and, you know, if unmitigated, it would have a regressive impact on households across the country. So, you know, we can't not tackle an industry because we are afraid of all of the impacts. Having said that, there's absolutely an issue around just transition, and the impacts will be felt not only in the airline industry, but in tourism as well. I would suggest that anyone who's interested should look at the ESRI paper, which has a very good outline and evaluation of those actual impacts on both on GDP and on tourism. But it will be different in every country. So yeah, that's my answer.
Grant, no, thanks.
Sorry,
Eva.
no silver bullets.
No, if there was, we'd have shot it a long time ago. Anyone else in the panel on that, just in general terms, the whole area of sustainability and just transition, and are we approaching this, or there's no silver bullet, as Aoife says, but is there a lack of political will to address the sustainability through the lens of a just transition, and is that holding up the whole show, so to speak? Anybody else want to comment on that in general?
I think
Kieran
so.
or Sean, yeah?
Yeah, sorry, Kieran, cut you off. Yeah, like this, I was just, you know, Google, who knows what the actual information is, but I was just looking up airline profits there. I think it's like, you know, what's a big number, but yeah, I think it was strengthening over the last couple of years, 3.1% net profit margin, 30 billion. I don't know, that's some industry agency. But I suppose the bigger question on that about like reconfiguring transport really in a way is what you're talking about. And there's a couple of, seems like there's two kind of sources of problems, and in a way, one is the inequality stuff. So, you know, like the air travel is interesting in that like a high proportion of you know, a high proportion of emissions is coming from, let's say, business travel, certainly private jets, etc., etc. So those are issues to do with inequality, really. And as you say, you know, business practices, do you really need to go? Like, why? Maybe times that a software team needs to get together for 4 days or something, but sometimes the manager's just going over to like make sure that they have everybody under, you know, under surveillance or whatever. So you know, and there's probably a fair amount of that that's just kind of almost routinized, not even thought about whether you know, whether it's necessary. But then there's probably other things that are like actually reconfiguring how people live, you know. And I mean the long distance air travel is a tricky one with families and transnational families and so on. But even simple things like I go back to the school bus, you know, can we make it easy for people to live? Like we really are talking about it's more urgent than this, but like different ways of living, really. So can we make it easy for people to, and this is in the policy framework of Social Justice Ireland, you know, it's basically about making it easy for people to take the bus, the cycle, etc., etc. But I drive to work here. I have to tell you, I'm only 3.5 miles away, and I drive to work. I love cycling, but I wouldn't cycle that road in a million years. And then you start putting together all the different parts of families, etc. And you got to think, what's the infrastructure that's there? So I really think there's a part of this which obviously falls back on individuals, but there's a part of it which is there's a huge part of it for policy and making it easy for people to like. So they are collective, like redesigns, you know. So there's a part of it that's kind of, I don't want to say it's easy. There's a part of it like, but the solving the inequality part won't, you know, will still leave all the other redesigning our lives part. So.
Yeah, I think it's very well stated, John, and it's a conundrum that all of us are interested in the problem we have to face up to that in some form or another. Matthew, you had your hand up there, like in school.
Yeah, yeah, very polite. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of echo, I think some of the things that Sean said. I think something I always come back to when we think about just transition, the green transition, is the commitment to, you know, almost kind of the ideological obsession with growth. That I know there's an burgeoning degrowth movement, but the issue is, I think, on a broader level, you know, while we have a political and economic system that basically demands that we must have some kind of growth every year, it's the paradox that we cannot have unlimited growth with limited resources. And yes, there are issues around, you know, consumer behavior habits, and we do have to change those. But as Sean said, really what we need to do fundamentally is change how we live. I mean, the public transport one is a fantastic example. So I live in Wicklow. If I want to get to UCD, I either have to drive or I take the one bus that comes once an hour for a little bit, and then I get stuck in all the traffic on the N11. If anyone knows that road, there is an accident every single day. And so again, using public transport is just not an option for me. If I lived in Dublin, you know, perhaps. And so it's one of these very difficult and unescapable things that we have to have this joined up approach where we have to have a whole suite of policies. And I think, again, coming back to the idea of the social contract, that's why this kind of reimagining the social contract is so important. We have to reimagine our roles as citizens. And we all have to kind of buy into this.
Yeah, and that is the major conundrum. Aoife, there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I suppose Matthew mentioned there, you know, the questions around growth and those structural issues and how we live our lives. And I think one of the things that might be very interesting in the coming years that will sort of has some relationship to this question about fast travel or air travel for those of us, you know, for people living in Ireland is what benefit can, let's say, the 4-day week or a shorter working week have, or more holidays? Because, you know, this allows us, well, first of all, on a practical level, to undertake slow travel. And second of all, it's, you know, a decent reward for work. And I think we're going to have to look at all these kinds of solutions in the future as well.
No question. And I suspect therein is probably the biggest challenge of all, and that is changing the mentality right across society, but particularly in certain areas of the power centres to come about that. But might be a question of needs must, and hopefully it won't be too late then. I have another question here for Kieran, and this one we could open up as well. Kieran, and in relation to education here, is the issue of overqualification simply a result of fewer high-end employment versus the level of graduates? And if so, do we need a change of economic policy to suppress low-paid jobs and generate high-end jobs, or do we simply need policies to open pathways towards high-end employment for graduates, especially for those from lower education backgrounds?
Well, there's there's probably some truth to a lot of that. The literature doesn't, when we're doing cross-country comparisons, there's no real clear kind of policy approach that jumps out. I mentioned Sweden and the Scandinavian countries who do well. There's, from my perspective, I think there is an argument for the role of state and direct state employment, especially if we're talking about, meeting long-term sustainability goals or something like that. So like one thing I have done some research on or written about is the just transition, and we're not going to meet our 2025 targets, we're not going to meet our 2030 targets, and maybe retrofitting in construction is a big part of that, and that we could do that through the state where market mechanisms are not resulting in widespread adoption because of upfront costs and stuff like that. So the creation of jobs on the demand side is, some people might think you're going back to the 70s or whatever, that this is an old school answer to a question in 2024, but there's clearly a glut of workers in certain, with certain qualifications, with certain levels of qualification, and then clear need in other sectors. And there's, even in construction, never mind retrofitting, but just in building housing, which is one of the main issues in Ireland at the moment, we're not attracting workers into that sector. Is there a role for the state to directly do that in a state building company which provides a floor for conditions and wages which the other private sector providers have to compete with for scarce skills, scarce labor? Yes, I think that would attract people who all the incentives are there to go to third level. I mean, if you look, the starting apprentice rate for some of these for construction in a lot of trades, €6-7 an hour. The minimum wage is now 14 or closer to €14 an hour in the local supermarket. If you're from a working class background, you have a Susie grant, which it's not, it hardly covers anything, but at the same time it tots up to a lot of hours at €6 an hour. So, and then young people are looking at construction and they're looking at it going, is it as dysfunctional as it was in 2008? If I take this career path in 5, 6, 7 years time, am I going to be forced to emigrate or be on social welfare or whatever? So there's a role for the state, I think, in providing decent employment in certain sectors where we're not, where we have clear need and clear, like on a macro level, policy priorities which are not being met at all. Housing and just transition, just to name two off the top. So yeah, I think the role is for, or the state could do more to tackle the imbalance of the relative attractiveness of going to because even still, I showed you that even when if they're not in a high-end job, a third level graduate, there's still more likely to be employment in lower in jobs with lower skills requirements, and so they'll get on in the labor market somehow. But could we do more hands-on approach to rebalance those pathways and the shares of people going to them, and what's on the other side in the labor market when they get there?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. Sean, you want to come in there?
Yeah, just very briefly. One was a question for Kieran, but you don't need to answer it here. But and that was it seemed like the effect of fathers' education on overqualification actually got stronger. So the class gap seems to have gotten stronger in recent years rather than better. But I might have got that wrong on the slide. But the other thing, just on the, I finished the last comment a little negatively. Like I do think on the sustainability, like there is an awful lot of it's not really zero sum, you know. Like it's not like you can have good things or you can have sustainability. Like half the things that people want are things that are more sustainable. Nobody really wants to sit in their car. They might say, "Don't take me out of my car," but nobody wants to sit in Lucan for 15 minutes every morning on the M4. I mean, and you can see that with the remote working. Like as soon as people get a chance to get out of it, they take it. And the 15-minute city, you know, it's not pie in the sky. That's what everybody wants. Like they want to be able to walk to their local sports club or whatever it is. So I think there's a lot of that, which is there's a huge overlap between the public service part, the livable communities, and sustainability. And you know, that I think, like on a positive side, you know, that's something that that like there's a political pathway there. I don't know how, you know, how you find it. I see Sean has a question about that, but there is a political pathway there. And the other thing I would say is, like, yeah, there was a question there about overqualification in the jobs. Look, we have a high rate of low paid jobs. Like we do have a lot of very well paid jobs at the top, and we have jobs in the middle, but we do have a high percentage of low paid jobs compared to other places in Europe. And we're kind of just locked into this low productivity, get the 22-year-olds in, but it's not only 22-year-olds, it's 43-year-olds working in low paid jobs in Ireland. That's particularly high. So, but like those jobs can also be upgraded, you know, like security doesn't have to be an unskilled job. It's also dealing with the company. It's like the first phase of the company. Like there's ways of upskilling all those jobs and improving the pay. So, and some of that is linked to, you know, our unionization rate being lower and so on. So I do think there are pathways there. So
it's also focus of policy and political economy in Ireland. We're talking about getting rid of the VAT right now for the sector, which is having a special rate of VAT for tourism. It's the lowest paid, you know, most precarious employment in Ireland by a country mile. So instead of foregoing that tax, we could use that tax that they do pay to, you know, do a retrofit, a state-led retrofit program, or, you know, more bus drivers in Dublin. I had to get just, you know, somewhere that's not very far away from me the other day, and I ended up getting a go-kart because looking at the public transport was, you know, you'd have been as quick to walk. It's about 10 kilometers away. I would have been as quick to walk. So, and on the overqualification question there, Sean, yes, it looks like that, but it's not as simple as that with the changing composition really of the adult population. So yes, with that measure, but there's more. It's more complex really than that.
Okay, the clock's pushing, but we have time for one other issue, and that is something that is brought up by a gentleman called Sean Healy, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. And Sean, and if I could go around to all of you just briefly to address this, if you could briefly. And Sean points out a new social contract is essential if Ireland is going to successfully and sustainably negotiate its way through its key challenges on services and related issues. Any ideas about how political parties could be encouraged in this general election to focus on the future of the social contract? Matthew, if I was to start with you.
A dubious honour. I think it's a very difficult question. I mean, in one way, the benefit of the Irish electoral system is the proportionality. So at least there is an opportunity for smaller parties to have a voice. So the first thing to do, I would say, would be to, you know, be able to leverage those smaller parties who might have quite an important role in the coalition building. You know, find those parties that have sympathy with this position of reimagining the social contract. But also, I mean, I think probably given the dominance of the two major parties, we really need a groundswell of some kind of grassroots organization and support. That can't be built overnight. There are pockets of this, obviously, but do we have time by the end of November? I'm going to be
Hardly.
cynical and say probably not. But I think the point being is it's never too late to start organizing. And to go back to things I'll say with PPNs and joined up approaches, you could probably actually use PPNs, to start using some of the mechanisms of local government to do this. But I really think we need a lot more grassroots support and organization. We need to leverage these citizens' assemblies. We need to start agitating and demanding for these kinds of things. And, Sean very briefly mentioned unionization and union density. It's these kinds of things that have won us, what we need in the past. And to be really old-fashioned and traditional, I think that's kind of the route we need to go again, to be honest.
Okay, Aoife, is there something that could be thrown into the mix there, you reckon, that just to point towards renewing a social contract?
Well, I mean, Matthew mentioned, I suppose, what I would mention, which is we've had, at this point, many citizens' assemblies who have been very adept at working through some very hard and tricky subjects and coming out, with some really amazing recommendations and then endorsed by the Oireachtas. So I think some of the structure exists where, perhaps that is a subject or a topic that, where you could convene a citizens' assembly. Another option would be to do it on an all-island basis, to bring in my other part of my job. There is a huge amount of change anticipated in the next 10 years or so. It's best, I think, to convene assemblies, civic, whatever you want to call them, stakeholder assemblies, etc., forums to talk these issues out. And on the political parties, I think some political parties may actually appreciate the stability that the discussion of a new social contract might bring to the political discourse or
very good point.
Discussion.
Very good point. Kieran?
Yeah, I'm just going to be boring and just point out the one, the main issue that I think is undermining the social contract, and I touched on it there, which is access to housing. Okay, and it's not. I don't think anybody will campaign on this, but in my opinion, they could or should. Is that we should be trying to make house prices fall. Right, this is a massive kind of issue in the background. We had years of very successful narrative control about wages rising being bad for us, and then at the same time not really saying it, but having to get the bank's balance sheets up to a certain health, which required the reinflation of property prices for all what it's a generational issue, mostly for older homeowners, to get out of negative equity as well on an individual level. So there's a distributional issue there. There's two groups there. One group in Irish society are doing very well, and one group in Irish society are not doing very well. And all of those life steps are being long fingered, or being, curtailed, being, less kids, smaller houses, if they get one or whatever. A cousin of mine just paid €400,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. Could not believe he's been saying for that for a long, long time. So I think that's it. And I'm a homeowner now, just a year. So I'm saying that, put me in negative equity. I mean, I'm not going anywhere for a while, but that's the case. And real wages, we do have high nominal wages. There are competitiveness issues there. We can't just keep throwing money, first-time buyers and stuff like that will inflate the house prices anyway. So we really need, for on a wider scale, we need the prices of houses to go down, both rent and selling prices.
The policy, I think, Kieran, across the political spectrum, that dare not speak its name, and I think you're absolutely spot on. Sean?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, the housing one is that's interesting. I mean, a lot of the people who are, I mean, not everybody, but a lot of the people who are sitting on a house that's appreciated, no more than myself, have kids that can't buy a house. So there's an overlapping thing in the middle there, like, you know, I would love the house prices to go down. I'm not interested in selling my house, you know. I mean, what I'm more interested in is, can your kids come home and buy a house when they come home, and you know. So and I think there's a lot of people in the same boat, like the kind of like middle classes that moved to the suburbs 25, 30 years ago. So, and yet when you're in, like I'm in Kildare North, and you know, there's no discussion of this. You know, so what happens when there's no discussion is the Facebook chat boards fill up with, you know, the place is full of, you know, immigrants in their cars, and it's nothing to do with immigrants in their cars. It's to do with, you know, 20 years of house prices and building and how communities have been constructed. So, so unless, I think the political system is a bit stuck. Like, it's hard to see how any new configuration of parties is going to come back from this election. So then they're kind of almost afraid to move then with some kind of program. So I think the program is going to have to come from around that, whether it's media driving the discussion or social movements putting new issues on the agenda, or, you know, social partners, or whatever it is, like wherever it comes from, because at the moment there's a bit of a vacuum there and bad things are filling the vacuum basically. So wherever it comes from, that kind of discussion has to open up around, you know, what we talked about here, which is not just where does the money go, but what are we kind of redesigning? That's what people are really crying out for. You know, the stuff about like, can I get 50x quid on this, is actually, you know, a substitute, because they don't feel like housing and health, etc., will get fixed. You know? Anyway.
Very true. Well, there may not be great hope for what emerges from the election, but I have to say, as is very often the case, what has emerged from today, I think, is plenty of food for thought right across various sectors. And I think hopefully it can go into the mix towards moving towards a better society, and particularly, and I think that whole idea of a social contract is one that has to keep being hammered home, because the current one is certainly at the very least in danger of fracturing, if not breaking. And as you say, housing is at the centre of all of that. I'd like to thank all of our panel today for those papers: Sean O'Ryan, Matthew Donaghy, Aoife Ní Lachlan, and Kieran Nugent. Thank you all very much. And just before I hand you back to John McGeady, just in a personal basis, I want to thank Suzanne Rogers in Social Justice Ireland for all her assistance and coordination today. And with that, I'll hand you back to John.
Thank you very much, Mick, for once again doing a very fine job moderating our annual policy conference. Thank you also to the speakers, to Kieran, Sean, Aoife, and Matthew, for providing engaging, insightful presentations. And thanks also to all of you who've tuned in this morning and now this afternoon. The papers for this conference will be collated into a conference book and published on our website in due course. Next Tuesday, we will publish Poverty Focus 2024, so keep an eye out for that. Our policy briefing for the general election, titled A Better and Fairer Future, is now up on our website, and talking about looking for political pathways to a new social contract. I'd encourage everybody to have a look at that. It lays out a whole suite of policy recommendations that we believe in Social Justice Ireland address the most pressing issues facing our society, and we think can really contribute to a transformative programme for government in the years ahead. Before the end of the year, we also hope to publish, or we will publish, the most recent edition of our European research series. And next month in December, we'll also be looking at the CSO's release of deprivation figures. So there are some of the things that Social Justice Ireland are going to be looking at over the coming weeks. Again, thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much again, Mick, for doing such a good job hosting. And to everybody, have a good afternoon.